because it mixes sugary glue syntax with explicit syntax, and as a single recursive piece of code that processes the whole thing. So we needed to fix that. SQL Translator, there is a moot port of it that almost passes the test suite that was done for Google Summer of Code last year. And that one I loudly declared to be not my problem, which is why I got Google to pay for fixing it instead. Thank you very much, Google. And I was thinking about, well, how do we track objects, how do we do sort of full persistence and stuff? And so I gave a talk last year called The Future of DBIX Class, which was a mixture of here are the things we got wrong, here are the things we got right. The one thing we did get right was the fact that result sets, apart from that bloody implicit iterator, appear functional. So when you do a search on a result set, you know that the return value you haven't mutated the original one, so you can pass them around. And I was looking at this and thinking, well actually, the concept of pure functional collections is a really nice one, especially when you throw in autobox so that you can treat an array vector as a collection object. So I thought, well, what about a query system? What about a query system that could compile to SQL or to Perl? And that way, if you're querying a database, you compile the query back into SQL, and it runs against the database. But if you already have the objects in memory, either because they weren't in the database at all, or because you already cached them, you compile it down to Perl, and run the query against that. And so that seemed like a great idea. And then I got distracted for about 6 months. I got distracted because I was thinking about collections and storage. And so we came up with this idea called data store. I have sat on several namespaces on CPAN that hopefully in the next year or so I'll actually start releasing things that we can pod into. But the idea of that was that we wanted to basically abstract out, so you have command objects. So you have a command object representing an insert, a command object representing a select. But generalize those so they can apply to other storage backends. And so you take that concept, and now if you've got command objects, suddenly you're in a situation where you can actually serialize them so that you run them together as a batch, which gives you the possibility to have a piece of Perl code that appears to be modifying the database, but actually writes out an SQL script to do the modification. And I think that's an absolutely fascinating concept, and I'm very much hoping that it works as well as I think it's going to work. But yeah, so I started actually building something along these lines, which was DBIX Data Store, which is sat in Shadowcat Git. I'm still not happy with it, although entertainingly presenting Perl.org, which is where the AppCNA videos are now. They are starting to be uploaded. We just need to process the movie files through to FLV, and then we can put those videos live. So thank you very much to Jonathan Hogue and everybody else who actually did the work. But presenting Perl is running on DBIX Data Store, but we haven't written SQL. And therein lies the problem. Because I went, hey, I haven't written SQL. Well, I don't mind writing SQL. Tried to get a couple of other people to use it to give me an idea of whether I got the design right, and they all went, my God, you have to write SQL? Why would we write SQL? We'll just use DBIX class. So apparently I couldn't get people to play with it much. The architecture, I think, is pretty much right. So I then went back and started looking at the query generation again. And Rob Kenyon worked on a fantastic thing called SQL Abstract 2. Which was a specification, and we had half an implementation. Although I'm ignoring the half an implementation. The problem being the SQL Abstract 2 half an implementation is a big heavy moose thing. And while all of my applications are already loading moose, I ideally would like to be able to replace SQL Abstract with this as well, when lots of its users are still living in the 20th century and deploying under CGI. So, need something lightweight to keep them happy. Which is fine. So we went, okay, well, what do we do? Here's the problem, databases are bastards. There is a reason why the first talk I ever gave about DBIX class was called Database Haters Anonymous. That was back in Vienna. There may be the odd one of you who still remember. I was a little livelier, a little more insane, and a lot more profane in those days. I still am, it's just not till about the fourth pint, right? Yes, the lack of swearing is Jesse Benson's fault. I don't know if anybody remembers, but last year Jesse challenged me for an entire night of beer that he still hasn't paid up on, not to swear during one of my conference talks, which was really funny when one of them was the Iron Man Lightning talk. Trying to give that without swearing was an experience, not an experience I intend to repeat. However, so the idea that we came up with is, okay, databases are people. Databases are all different. So, what is an operator? String concatenation. Postgres is sensible. Postgres string concatenation is an operator. You go string 1, operator string 2. MySQL, it's a function. So it turns out that if you're trying to do a general query system, you can't distinguish between functions and operators, even if you're only targeting SQL, let alone targeting anything else. So that's sort of run into being something of a problem. And then we went, hey, we remember something that didn't distinguish between functions and operators. It's called Lisp. And so we had an experiment around, and we settled for a node system that was hashgraphs rather than array-graphs because, well, Lisp is all very well. As I believe Larry once said, it has all the joy of oatmeal with fingernail clippings in it. And trying to process it's not natural to process array graphs like that in Perl. I mean, okay, one could argue that Perl is basically unnatural by definition, but that's half the fun of Perl, right? So we started looking at generating specification that made different types of queries nodes, had an expression syntax. And I've been looking at that and going, hey, you know, RGBS wrote this thing called RX, which does validation of JSON trees cross-language. So what we're going to do is we're going to define the data query specification using RX, at which point we then can serialize out the query tree in a form that can be loaded into other languages and validated. And if you're going to do that, well, Ingy, bless his crazy crackfield soul, wrote a module called TestML, which is basically a markup language for doing cross-language tests. So we can do a compliance suite that runs in other languages as well. So I have been slowly but surely recruiting people, and with a bit of luck, once I get an alpha of data query out the door, we're actually going to get involvement from the Python and Ruby database communities to see if they can produce a compliant implementation in their languages. So instead of having a query system that can only query SQL and Perl objects, it will be SQL, Perl objects, Python objects, and Ruby objects. In this modern day where, you know, there's many heathens out there using these other inferior languages for things, I think it's important to be able to sort of break down the barriers and let them have the benefit of our wisdom, you know? And so the idea, once we get the query system operating sensibly, we can build a nice thin layer on top of that binds it straight to a database. So you don't have to have objects at all. So all of these, oh, I don't like ORMs, they involve objects. Objects are strange and horrible things. I just want queries. And okay, I think those are traditionally called DBAs, right? And so hopefully we can produce a base layer system where we can actually share a query generator with people doing that. And I believe somewhere in the audience here will probably be Anton Berezin, who wrote a fantastic thing called DBIX Perlish, which is basically a direct query engine that works by parsing Perl octaves with the most amazingly scary B:::: code that you've ever seen outside of, well, anything else parsing octaves, really. I do admittedly plan to parse octaves eventually, but the first version is going to use operator overloading. So the idea here is that we end up with something that gives us a link-like thing for Perl. but where the object part is optional. Link as in C#. If you haven't looked at this, LINQ, it is very cool. It kind of scares me to be saying that's something that Microsoft did. It's very cool, but it is. And they did hire a lot of very smart language implementers. You know, hey, let's steal the people we like who helped invent Java and let them do it better. Which is, yeah, pretty much what C# is. And I salute them. It's not a bad attempt. It certainly worked a lot better than when they hired the lead architect to VMS and he produced Windows NT. Well, it is better than VMS. Usually. And you see, the fantastic thing here is I mentioned tester now, I mentioned RX. If I hadn't taken so long failing to come up with a design for this, I wouldn't actually have the tools to implement the design that I've come up with. So, you know, all hail the build community for catching up and building things I didn't realise I wanted. And another thing that I didn't realise I wanted is variable magic. Variable magic is wonderful, written by Vincent Penn. He is French, so that's almost certainly a mispronunciation of his name. But since he talks so quietly, I've never actually been able to hear him say his name. I'm afraid I'm going to have to stick with calling him Vincent Penn. The man's a genius. You should look at all of his modules, especially no auto-vivification and no indirect, both of which manage to banish two very annoying warts of Perl. And really do help with avoiding failing and writing code and you know, they're just extra strictures. It's always nice to have the compiler catch a mistake before you do, right? However, I think I was supposed to have a point. Let's see if we can get there. So, variable magic. Variable magic lets you track changes to objects in a way that's much lighter and much more elegant than tar. And this solves the other big problem that I had, which was that Tangram manages to have the objects not knowing they're persistent by tying everything. And it does work, but oh my. It's a little bit gross under the hood. So, variable magic, okay, it only works on Perl 5 version 10 plus, for the things that I want, but it's there. In a year or two, everybody's going to be deploying version 10 anyway, and it's going to allow sensible tracking of changes to objects, which means we should be able to let you define a straightforward Moose class, define a mapping to the database, and have the code able to track and update those objects without the object ever having to know they're in the database, without an extra base class to provide persistence, without even an extra meta class to provide persistence. Plain, simple Moose objects, and in fact, because we're not needing to hook into Moose, plain simple anything objects. So all four of you who still think that Moose is not a good object system can use it still as well. And you know, this is the how do we take over the world plan, right? How do we take over the world? Well, you know, you start by promising software by Christmas and then it all goes downhill from there. If you missed the game at the start, Larry, the point is I made the same stupid mistake.
I appreciate it.
Not quite so spectacularly, and you know, not with the ability to actually design a programming language, which is why I'm sticking to failing to release an ORM. But anyway. So we had the future of DRX class, and I had all of these ideas, and they were halfway there, and I thought, well, how do I try and present these ideas when I don't have a complete running system? And this is where the trouble we got on the mountain came in, because I thought, well, you know, we can do a tale, and I gave you the worst pun. The other bad pun was that the